how can you get a cataloger who wants the record to be perfect, who spent the whole his or her whole life at making the catalog perfect?
Supposedly perfect. We don't know, that's a myth.
But it's perfect. I mean, their record perfect, you know, and
well,
somebody's going to see it on OCLC, and I mean, how do you get them to accept the fact that the record might be wrong? You know,
well, you know, we need to learn to deal with mistakes, and I mean, the Library of Congress is no longer perfect. It never was to begin with, but now, 15 years ago, they made the decision that they were no longer be perfect, and they're moving away from that whole idea.
Do you think we need to hire staff psychologists to kind of get us over the hump here?
Well, you know, I think that one of the things that is happening in many libraries is bringing in outside consultants, because that objectivity assists. It's difficult to make change internally when people feel like there's political motivations behind it, or there's personal things going on. But when you bring in someone objective, who's out there, who's well respected, who people know, and when they come in and talk and can say these kinds of things, they take it much better, especially if they've not been keeping track of the literature, especially if they have isolated themselves away from what's really going on out there. And when they hear someone talk about these things, that often can help then the library administration to start making those changes. But you know, I think there's a certain amount of hand-holding, as we talked about before, but after a certain point in time, you just have to tell them to let it go. And you have to show them, and I mean, the literature is replete with this, and I mean, the cataloging literature of the last 7 years, but they have to read it. It's full of this idea that we want to get away from this perfect idea, because it's not there, it's a myth. And that we really need that, there's nothing wrong with cataloging something with the title and you know, title and an author, period. And if we have time, maybe flipping in a subject. But you know, in this day and age of keyword searching, it just doesn't matter anymore. And especially, I talked about this before, any library that still has internal authority control units is wasting money. They're wasting their money.
Are there ways, and I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, are there ways to enable catalogers, other librarians, to do the research that you're talking about, the reading and so on? Or should administrators expect them to do it on their own, or how should you work?
Well, as I said, I think if the administrators, or if someone in middle management, for instance, can be appointed as the person who's monitoring the research, who's monitoring the situation outside of the library, and becomes the communicator, becomes the person who is allowed access to the library list, or whatever it is, whether for all faculty and staff, all librarians and staff, that can then, as things happen, and they're known that they monitor the blogs, because I think that's where I get most of my information on a daily basis. When something looks good, it pops up, and all I do is provide the link in a message, and I say, here's an interesting article, what do you think? And oftentimes, you know, and I've built in the culture that, you know, I want people to talk about this online. If they can say it through an email, that's great. And I also say, is this something that we should maybe plan a hot topics around, if I feel it's really relevant? And what happens is that once you start doing that and people start responding, and there's always at least a couple people in an organization who are interested in talking these things out. It's usually the library staff and not the librarians, to tell you the truth, which is good.
Which is interesting.
It is interesting, and I found that in everywhere. It's always the library staff.
Well, the whole notion of making training part of your culture is really what
and that's what it has to be, is that we want an informed staff, because it's not about, you know, the library dean or upper administrations guiding the library. All of us are a team. We all need to be on board. We all have a role to play. And one of the people talked to me today about the whole thing I talked about with networking, that it only takes one person talking to another person, for instance, to make out a life-changing context, especially if you're a consultant. So, you know, a library staff member walking across campus who's excited about the library, who meets the wife of the provost on the way to lunch and says what a good job the library's doing, you can bet she's going to tell the provost that night that she heard it from a library staff that they're doing a great job there. Now, that kind of a marketing thing you can't train for, but what you want to try to do to instill in your culture is that these personal contexts can become life-changing in terms of budget decisions. And that's what's important, is that the whole organization is on board in terms of the marketing and the outreach of the library and its mission.